Welcome to the Alberta Prosperity Project Podcast. If you're ready to listen, sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. Thursday, July 14th, 2022. Welcome to episode 10 of the Alberta Prosperity Project Podcast. I'm your host, Hunter, today, joined today with Tanner, who is actually in my living room today. Tanner, how are you?
I am in your living room. It's quite correct, which means that your house or your condo is now more exciting than it perhaps has ever been before, I think. Is that correct?
I wouldn't say so. I used to be able to have a smoker on my deck, as you know, but
that's true.
Yes, no. If that was the case, it would definitely be up there, though. I must admit, yes. Maybe if you want to inform the listeners why you are in my living room today, that'd be great.
Well, that's true. So I am in your living room because on Monday and Tuesday, we, as a group of APP and volunteers and members and coordinators and regional leaders and board members, etc., were at the Calgary Stampede. Were we not? We were at Ranchman's on Monday for a pancake breakfast, which was excellent. And then we had another venue or a function to do on Tuesday. And so, we've just had so much fun. The breakfast at Ranchman's, a pancake breakfast with sausages and eggs and etc., all of that good stuff, orange juice. Absolutely. Was just phenomenal, right? It was, how many people did we have come out? Do you know?
So it was a huge event. We loved seeing everybody out there. A lot of new people that said they had never been to an event. So that was awesome. Had some great live music by Lindsay Butler was her name. She did awesome. People really enjoyed it. It was just such a fun atmosphere, such a good Calgary hospitable Stampede feel. So yeah.
Exactly. And that's also, I should mention, why I'm wearing my hat today. So as you know, I wear this hat actually semi-regularly when I head to town for groceries or go for coffee in the morning, what have you. I actually enjoy wearing it quite a lot and getting all the funny looks and so on, and people asking, why are you wearing such a hat? But during Stampede, I thought it was absolutely appropriate to brandish the hat and show as many people as possible, my sense of style or fashion, what I think is fashionable. Is it fashionable? Well, someone can debate it, but I quite like it. So that's why I'm wearing it today, because I thought, there's no more perfect time to wear a hat like this than today. And one last thing I might also mention. The breakfast was fantastic, as we said at Ranchman's, but my favorite thing was that the syrup was room temperature. I am of the belief that maple syrup or syrup in general has to be at room temperature to serve on a stack of pancakes. I do not like it when syrup is cold and then goes on hot pancakes. To me, that's just intolerable. It cannot happen. It absolutely cannot happen. I don't know what your thoughts are on it. But because the syrup at Ranchman's was room temperature when they were serving the pancakes and the sausage, it just made it all the more excellent, so to say, to have a breakfast.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, no, and I mean, for those that have met me in person, obviously you can likely know that I love syrup of all forms and kinds, but I think that at the end of the day, like you said, it was a great breakfast, and I mean, I don't know if I want to look at pancakes now for the next little bit. It was very, very good, don't get me wrong, but yes, as usually happens at Stampede, you sometimes just don't want to look at food for the next little bit, so that's okay. We're, going back to normal eating habits, if you want to call it that, but I guess with that said, moving forward into the episode with Stampede, obviously we saw lots of ranchers and cowboys, and we saw all the cowboy hats, lots of people in cowboy boots, the big belt buckles and that, and we're seeing people that are either farmers or supporting farmers are coming out in droves. And we're not only seeing this at the Calgary Stampede, but across the country of Canada as we're supporting farmers over in the Netherlands right now. So for those that haven't heard, obviously the Dutch farmers at this moment are protesting regarding the European Union trying to bring in new regulations, A, on fertilizer, and B, on how many cattle you can have based on emissions. And if you emit too much, they can come and get your farm, or they can mandate that you eliminate some of your livestock, if you want to call it that. That's the more correct term, I guess, if we want to say. And so I guess obviously it sparked a huge debate with farmers saying there are going to be food shortages, and they're already seeing some of that impact. But I guess one first question that I'll ask you is, what do you think the main purpose of these Dutch farmers protesting is, and should we be supporting them or not?
The APP is in absolute support of the farmers protesting. They are courageous and they are valiant, and they are doing it for a righteous cause. And so we declare our absolute and total and full support for those protesters. The reason really is that they're being attacked at present, and not in an outright sort of war, but they're being attacked insofar as their ability to produce what they know is good, and their ability to engage in actions like farming for food that they know is good and beneficial for the society as a whole, is under attack. And so there is this globalist UN, WEF, WHO, et cetera, movement, this anti-human movement to restructure and reshape the society into a picture or into a state that we do not want to follow it. And those farmers don't want to follow it into that state either. And that includes, reducing fertilizer or restricting fertilizer, abolishing private property, and, having the state interject and trespass into domains that are not their own, and so on. And so these farmers, obviously influenced by Tamara Leach and her group of protesters, the convoy, have also taken to the streets in their tractors. They have this, you've seen the pictures. There's these massive committee of tractors that have totally overtaken the highways and so on to protest and declare their absolute intention to resist this push for this new order. And so we think it's phenomenal. We put our support behind them, this protest, and they're doing something exceedingly courageous in order to protect what they know is necessary to encourage human flourishing.
Yeah, absolutely. And that gives a nice segue, obviously, for the listeners that, either caught the episode last week or were unable to with Dr. Dennis Modry. You had mentioned that you hauled grain for a little bit for some farmers in the Lloydminster area. And so I guess maybe can you touch just a little bit, obviously a lot of people may not know the main reason for fertilizer or why it's so important. So can you maybe first touch on why it's important, and B, why it costs so much? I mean, we hear farmers often saying how expensive fertilizer is getting, and I guess why is that the case and what's happening there?
Right. Good question. So fertilizer is nitrogen fertilizer, to be specific, but all fertilizers. But nitrogen fertilizer is absolutely critical for the current yields that we achieve here in Canada and in the Western provinces. Quite simply, crops chew on fertilizer or on nitrogen for food. They need nitrogen. And if they don't have it, they can't grow, or they certainly can't grow to the capacity that we need them to grow. It's like you and I have a breakfast in the morning of cereal or toast, what have you. We need it in order to start the day. And then we need something at lunch and we need something at supper. The same is true for crops. They need nitrogen. The problem is they can't, I'll be more specific in a moment, but as a general rule, they can't transform the nitrogen in the air as it exists, as N2. They can't take that nitrogen and they can't transform it into something that is consumable for themselves. They're not able to chew it up. That's how I describe it. It's like a baby without teeth, right? They're unable to make it soluble to digest. And so, well, put simply, the farmer has to help them out. Now, certain crops like peas are actually able to convert nitrogen. It's a very select group of crops, but some can take the nitrogen from the air, they can convert it, they can use it as they need, and then they deposit the nitrogen back into the soil. Okay, so that's a couple of crops. But other crops like durum or barley or oats, cereals, et cetera, they can't do that, right? They don't have that capacity. They don't have that ability. And when you farm as much as we do, when you continually recycle and use the land year after year after year to meet whatever self-imposed quotas you have as a farmer to supply the world and the country with food, well, there's no real way for the soil itself to be replenished of nutrients because it's always being used, and the nutrients are always flowing into crops, into, like I said, durum or rye or whatever, what have you. So you have to help them out. And so when you go seeding, right, when you go air seeding, as you inject the crop into the ground, you also give a bit of nitrogen fertilizer, right? And maybe some MES or other fertilizers, but we're talking today about nitrogen. And you just, you put it in with the crop, and then it gives it a boost of energy to help it grow. And this is not something trivial either. Like that's critical. It's a critical distinction to make. This is not a trivial increase in yield, right? It's a massive increase in yield when you add fertilizer. We'll maybe put the paper at the bottom. Sure. But I was recently reading about a professor who was talking about nitrogen fertilizer. And his conclusion was that without nitrogen fertilizer, you would have some 3 to 4 billion people not living today who currently do, because of nitrogen fertilizer. It's that critical, right? It is astonishing how important that invention is. It might be it is one of the most important inventions in the last 200 years, without a doubt, right? Yeah. Without it, the difference in the size of the population in the world is massive. And so it's critical. Now, why is it so expensive, right? You asked that as well.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. So, well, it's not as expensive right now because the demand isn't as high. But, a couple of months ago, it was like $1,700, $1,600, $1,500 per ton compared to the $800 it was a year ago, right? There's a huge difference in the price of fertilizer. Why is that? Well, there are a lot of reasons. Like those who are also championing this WEF global reset, right? Mr. Trudeau and his government, and this is not a partisan statement, it's simply objective, have committed to reducing emissions on nitrogen fertilizer or nitrogen fertilizer emissions by 30% from 2020 levels by 2030.
Right.
And so if you're a farmer or if you're an investor, you're looking at the future of nitrogen and you're going, it doesn't look very good, right? It's going to certainly be in short supply. And so you start buying now, and people start buying as much as they can, at trying to anticipate what's going to happen next year. And that drove up the price. Then, of course, you realize that nitrogen itself, nitrogen fertilizer is made with natural gas, with hydrocarbons, and with air. But we have a carbon tax, right, on the hydrocarbons themselves, and so the input costs are increasing. You also realize that in the eastern provinces, most of their fertilizer comes from Russia, or did, of course, before an embargo was sanctioned on Russia on fertilizer. And so they had to find their fertilizer somewhere else, which meant that the domestic price of fertilizer increased because they were scavenging and looking, and the supply itself had diminished. The supply had shifted to the left, which drives up the price. And you have all of these things, people still need fertilizer. What I'm saying is basically, you have inflation. A perfect storm has been conjured to make the price of fertilizer and farming inputs themselves as high as possible, unmanageably high, in order to, which will lead to, of course, the driving up of the cost of food, which is already exorbitant because of inflation and things of that nature. So,
right. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, even for those that haven't seen some of the articles, most of them do touch on it. I've noticed where the European Union, and especially in the Netherlands, they're doing this, what they say is to help curb climate change. The entire story being swayed is that, look, we're not doing this just to harm farmers. And they're saying their intent isn't to do that, but it's actually to stop this crisis of climate change. And so I guess in that case, is it maybe not worth maybe some of the suffering that farmers and consumers might face if we're stopping climate change and allowing, the farms to keep on going? Often it's stated, farms can't keep on farming if we have climate change going the way that it's going. So would we not support maybe putting this ban on fertilizer, or what's kind of the take on that?
Oh, well, those politicians could start by stopping flying private jets, right? They could maybe not drive their massive motorcades around the country in order to brandish just how popular they are, right? They don't have to fly to Glasgow to go to COP26. They don't have to use the heat in their homes or their hotels or whatever expensive mansions they live in order to keep off from freezing to death, kind of thing. Like it's so hypocritical. That's what's intolerable about this whole thing, is that, no one can use anything that's advanced in technology unless it's totally renewable, which nothing truly is, really. I mean, we can talk about nuclear and stuff after, but like wind power and stuff comes from fossil fuels. Solar power comes from fossil fuels, from burning coal to make the panel, etc. Nonetheless, is the argument legitimate? No, it's not. That we have to think about this for a moment. We have to stop using nitrogen fertilizer, which is critical to feed the peoples of the earth, in order to stop climate change, so that the peoples of the earth will, I guess, survive. But you see how it's like that whole argument collapses in on itself, because if you stop using nitrogen fertilizer, like, people will starve. It's objective. Either you completely change the amount of farmland that you have in the country, which you can't do. You have to level cities in order to start farming locations like that again, to keep production at what it was, not yields, but production itself, which they won't do. Or people won't get as much food. Right. There's only two options. And it's obviously going to be the second one. So basically what's really being said is you have to sacrifice this portion of humanity in order to save humanity. Right. Which of course it's self-defeating. But not only so, it's like, well, show us the models. Right. You look at climate science, and we're not climate scientists, but you look at climate science and you see so quickly how politicized that science has become, right? Politics and climate science have merged into one entity, so to say, and have become this politicized way of ruling without anyone being able to object to it. So you can do whatever you want, in the name of climate science or climate change, and it allows you to act dictatorially in order to save the world. But none of the models have, their predictions are false, and they've been proven to be false time and time and time and time again. And that will only continue because the science itself is so politicized. So is it a legitimate argument? No. Are there emissions that are caused by fertilizer? Oh, yes, of course there are. There are emissions caused by almost everything we do. There's a balance and a trade-off that exists in a world of scarcity. But you have to look at the data. And when you do, you realize, for example, that in China, they over-fertilize their fields by hundreds of percent for the yields that they're achieving, right? Because there comes a point where you're fertilizing too much and you've reached a maximum yield, and you can start burning fields or who knows what, but you can fertilize too much, and that's what China's doing. And so the pollution they're creating is in significant excess.
Right.
You compare that to Canada, to Saskatchewan, Alberta, Manitoba, et cetera, and you see that we are almost perfectly efficient. We neither we neither over-fertilize or under-fertilize. We are right efficient, so that the yields that we are achieving now are in conjunction with the amount of fertilizer that we implant into the ground. And so if you use less fertilizer, you'd have smaller yields. If you use more fertilizer, you would have an excess of pollution. And so we are right efficient.
Right.
So what I mean to say is, if you want to reduce the farmer's usage of fertilizer, you will reduce his yields. It will not get better.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And that, ties in nicely to the next point, I guess. And I'm sure most listeners can guess where we're going with this. But what exactly is the Alberta Prosperity Project proposing we do for farmers to help solve this issue that's being seen now in the Netherlands? I didn't mention earlier, but Canada also has mentioned we are going to be trying to limit fertilizer usage of farmers. The Trudeau government has said about 30% by 2030. So how would we protect the farmers, and how do we stop this, I guess, from coming here?
Right. So this invasion of farming by the WEF, WHO, UN, et cetera, and then prime ministers around the world, right, that these current farmers are protesting. It's an anti-human agenda, right? It's so clearly anti-human because, one, it doesn't correspond to reality, right? The reality is fertilizer is necessary to achieve the yields that we currently do in order to feed as many people as we currently do. If you eliminate our ability to use nitrogen fertilizer, you will decrease the amount of food that is available in the economy and in the world. That's the reality. And you cannot disregard that reality, even though, at least on the surface, publicly, politicians are trying to disregard that reality. Now, it's anti-human because it invokes our unnecessary suffering, right? So when you reduce food, when you reduce fertilizer, you reduce the amount of food available. When you reduce the amount of food available, what will happen? No, people will starve, right? Sure. People won't be able to eat, which is expressly anti-human because it brings about the human's demise, his death. And so this is exactly what the APP is standing against, right? This is the reason for our inception and our creation. We have seen, and it's not just limited to fertilizer, right? There are other policies too, but we have seen, as so many other individuals in the nation have seen, this anti-human globalist agenda being pushed on all of us, not just a select few, but everyone, right? Farming and fertilizer affects everybody because everybody eats. And we say it's expressly anti-human, and it's not right. And we're trying to propose these policies and so on that harmonize with reality so that humans themselves and individuals and communities themselves might flourish instead of live in this state of struggling to survive. So what are we proposing? Well, the first thing you do is you eliminate the carbon tax, right? You immediately bring the input cost down, right? The second thing is, there are so many things you could do, right? Eliminate the carbon tax. The second thing you do is simply let the farmer farm as he knows how to farm, right? This idea of hammering him or her with restrictions like we do in just about every industry in Canada is utter nonsense. Sure. It's one thing if the regulations are useful and they protect a third party that isn't involved in a transaction, but they don't in most cases. But in most cases, it just expands the bureaucracy to such a size that it becomes totally unmanageable. And all we're left with is all of this red tape and people trying to navigate around a law they don't even understand. And even it seems like the legislators don't understand it, right? Because it's just a massive bureaucracy that increases the size of its power, right? When you have all these regulations, the scope and the ability to influence for the politician becomes all the greater. So you eliminate the carbon tax. You eliminate all of these restrictions, right? You allow individual farmers and individuals to trade freely, right? As free as can possibly be, right? You divorce climate science and politics entirely, right? That politics is not the business of science, and the vice versa is true. Science is not in the business of politics. And when the two are merged, they form this unholy entity that has serious danger to create insurmountable amounts of harm in society, right? Like, and we've seen this over the last, 3 years for sure, but really it's you can see it over the veil of history, right? It's often that the politician uses science to expand his enterprise, so to say, that is often very, very frightening, right? And very, very bad and very, very dangerous. So you do that, and you simply allow the farmer to farm, as I mentioned, to know as he knows how to farm. If he thinks that he should put more nitrogen fertilizer in his crop, then by all means he should do so. It's one thing if a man is dumping fertilizer, right? If he's dumping tridents of fertilizer in the field just for fun, of course, but no one's going to do that, right? That's the kicker.
Won't be a farmer much longer.
No, that's exactly right. It's like, do we honestly believe that these farmers are just using fertilizer because they like seeing their input costs rise for no particular reason? Is that what the idea is, right? Like, it's just laughable, right? Right. You hear that you don't need fertilizer and stuff, and it's like, really? So all of these farmers who are trained specifically in this discipline, and they do it very, very well, all of them are just doing all of these things just because for fun. They're just implanting the soil with fertilizer because they feel like it. And that's like, of course not. It's because they know that the crop needs nutrients. It needs fertilizer in order to achieve the yields that it has to achieve. And as such, if they don't use fertilizer, they won't achieve those yields. And then the society and the farmer will be all the worse off because of it. So in line with the other policies, if you were to simplify it into one banner, what the APP is proposing is that government get out of the business of farming. That's what it needs to be, right? Let the individual farm. He's running his own business. Let him do it as only he or she knows how to do it, so that you might enable them to achieve the highest standard of life possible for themselves and their families, and as a consequence, increase the overall well-being of the society in total.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. And that, I think, was a great brief overview of everything, not only what's going on and what we're seeing right now, but what we might see in the future and how we're going to get out of it with the plan of the Alberta Prosperity Project. So with that said, if someone wants to help support the podcast or support the project overall of educating all Albertans on the merits and benefits of independence for Alberta, we encourage you to check out our website. We're www.albertaprosperityproject.com. That link is also in the show notes. You can click there. You can join us at that membership site as well. And we'd be happy to have you on board. As well, if you want to volunteer, we'd love that as well. It'd be so great to have you on board. We already have now over 1,000 volunteers with the project, which we are so excited to see. It's been so great to see this exponential growth. And for those of you across the pond of the ocean, if you are somewhere in Europe or something like that, we do stand with you here at the APP. Keep on doing what you're doing. The world is watching with great hope, and we're so proud of what you're doing with that. With that said, we're also going to be coming up to Lloyd next Thursday as well. If you want to check us out at that event, both Tanner and myself will be there back at the stomping grounds of where we're both from. It'd be a lot of fun to meet you there. It would be great to see you there as well. With that said, though, we will see you next week on the podcast, Tanner. It was great talking to you again, and might charge you for staying in my house this week. We'll see. Who knows?
Maybe you should. Okay, see you next week. Thanks.
You bet. Bye.